Our view is that Iran can play a constructive role if it is helping to send the same message to the Iraqi government that we're sending, which is that Iraqi only holds together if it's inclusive, and that if the interests of Sunni, Shia, and Kurd are all respected.
As is often the case in a run-up to any conflict, plenty of the so-called experts are missing a few key points. In the case of what America can or might do in Iraq, the clarion call has been for airstrikes. But the terrorist group now scorching Iraq is certainly not the standard military force. That means a new and improved tactic to draw them out and exterminate them if necessary. Here on MidPoint, welcoming the associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation and an expert on tactical matters, Colin Clarke joins us today. Colin, thanks for being with us again today.
Thanks, Ed.
Let's start out with what is a misconception here, and I think we talked about this briefly, but it needs to be discussed. There is a misconception here between ISIS and al-Qaida and exactly who is involved, what the strengths are, and where these different groups are getting all of their members, correct?
Sure. So core al-Qaida is traditionally the group formerly headed by Osama bin Laden, currently headed by Ayman al-Zawahiri, based in the border area along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, more likely situated in Pakistan proper. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, is this group that's been charging throughout Iraq, seizing territory, seizing large weapons depots, and led by Baghdadi, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. This group is seemingly more violent than core al-Qaida, has been taking part in levels of violence that have reached enemy, so almost violence for the sake of violence. It's a highly sectarian group that's been targeting Shiites throughout the country. And it's more of a traditional insurgency, or at least it's growing into more of a traditional insurgency than core al-Qaida, which is more of a terrorist group.
Let's talk about, you said violence for the sake of violence, and I think that should be discussed as well here, because we are seeing, certainly in pictures and video, some incredibly brutal scenes of violence here. Is this being done to make an impact? Because let's face it, we know that every war is televised anymore. So this group must know, certainly through American media, global media, also social media as well, that their message is getting out there. And would it not be fair to say that they are looking to be as brutal as possible in front of the eyes of the world?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, this is a very deliberate part of the ISIS strategy. And in anarchic or chaotic internal conflicts like this, or what's broadening into more of a regional conflict, sometimes the most brutal group is the most successful. Clearly, this is winning the group favor in gaining recruits. They've been live tweeting some of their actions over the past couple of days. And so, yeah, this is absolutely a very deliberate strategy on the part of this group. If you'll recall, several years ago, there was a letter intercepted sent by Ayman al-Zawahiri to then leader of al-Qaida in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, saying, basically telling him to cool it, that this violence, to be a bit more parsimonious or discriminate in violence, because it's giving the group a bad image. ISIS has clearly disregarded any advice along those lines and has implemented extreme brutality as part of its overall strategy.
Colin, from a tactical standpoint here, was the ISIS group, whomever they're made of here, were they simply just tactically smarter and tactically better, or is it the other side perhaps that they took advantage of what was an ill-prepared / ill-trained Iraqi force?
Well, I think it's a combination of the two. Clearly, ISIS has been biding its time. This isn't something that a group that's sprung up overnight. This is a group that's been in existence, that's clearly been developing its strategy and planning this offensive for months, if not years. The U.S. withdrawal in earnest in 2011 provided somewhat of a power vacuum. And then on the flip side, clearly the Iraqi security forces, at least to date, haven't been able to stem the flow of these militants south toward Baghdad. I think we've reached somewhat of a stalemate now, but this next week is going to be extremely telling to see what kind of developments take place throughout Iraq, and whether or not the U.S. gets involved with something more than advisors.
Colin, one thing that is striking here, certainly from President Obama's speech, and now what we are learning here, is there may indeed be some sort of a change going on in the government. There was certainly not a rousing support for Nouri al-Maliki in the president's statement, basically saying he would back him or whomever else happens to be in power at the time. It would seem that we are starting to see something going on right now to form a new government. I guess the biggest thing is the vacuum that this might cause, because there needs to be a consideration. Maliki is in power now. There would have to be votes. There would have to be an election. There would have to be a number of things that would happen. How dangerous is any sort of a vacuum going to be at this critical stage?
Oh, extremely dangerous. Now, we have to remember that insurgency is armed politics, right? And so ISIS, the group that's fighting against the Iraqi government, is essentially conducting acts of political violence. On the flip side, shoring up the Iraqi government in Baghdad is going to take a lot of work. Now, whatever comes next, if it's a new government or if it remains the Maliki government, I think the United States and other regional actors have a fairly significant role to play. There's been a lot of speculation about how a potential collapse in Iraq could affect Iran, and I'd say, with people speculating that this could be a potential boon for Iran, but I think quite the opposite. No state wants to have two failed states bordering it. So to the east, Afghanistan, and to the west, Iraq. I think any power vacuum in Iraq would be a net loss for the Iranians.
There is a thinking process here that if Iran does get involved with the United States, any type of partnership here with Iran would legitimize Iran's activities in the country, and they could be expected to parlay that cooperation into concessions from the U.S. in negotiations over Tehran's nuclear program. Do you think they've thought that out this far?
I don't know. I mean, that could be a stretch. I think what the United States is good at and what our diplomats are good at is kind of compartmentalizing any kind of quid pro quo between the two governments. And so I think the focus would be on stability and security in the short term, in the immediate term, and other concessions gained down the road at this point are mere speculation.
Let's talk a little bit about tactics here, because we've always discussed the fact that this is a very different army and a very different group than what we've seen before, the way ISIS has moved and the way that they have moved so quickly here over Iraq. Let's look at it from an American standpoint then, or any sort of force to go ahead and go after these guys. We've talked about airstrikes, but then again, you need to know where the airstrikes are going to be. That certainly indicates you have to have ground intelligence to be able to get this done. Now, knowing that ground intelligence takes time, knowing that you then have to pick out your targets, give us an idea, if you will, of the concept that you see that may be forming at this point in the American war rooms right now on a tactical way to go after this group of terrorists that seem to be really outsmarting a lot of people at this point.
Sure. Well, I think airstrikes are obviously on the table and are part and parcel of any broader plan. But the key is part of any broader plan. So this airstrikes alone, as we've seen in Libya, are not an end unto themselves. Airstrikes won't help you with political stability in the long term, in addition to airstrikes. And that includes targeting some of the forms of tangible support to the insurgents. So some of these rat lines that are running back and forth between Syria and Iraq that are strengthening the group from an operational perspective. So the flow of fighters, of money, of men and materiel in general, those lines need to be targeted in order to make any kind of what you mentioned as tactical progress.
Would that then come from having to go back to Syria? Because it would seem that then a lot of what they're getting right now has started to come from Syria, or at least that's where it began. But now along the way, they're starting to get materials that are being left behind by the Iraqi military.
I mean, certainly this is broadening into a truly regional conflict. A lot of folks have asked the question, well, what's the objective of ISIS? And I think we need to look no further than the actual name of the group, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. This is a group that wants to form a Sunni Islamic State across the borders of Syria and Iraq. And it looks at current day borders as largely Western imposed. And this is a group that's going to fight to solidify any gains on the ground now.
Would the biggest thing be on the ground? Now, we've talked about the United States sending about 300 members of the military there to assist and train. And again, we're talking about more training. It would seem to me that basic military strategy would say that if you're going to have airstrikes, you then have to follow up with something on the ground at that point. Now, we're not talking about American boots on the ground again. The president has said that will not happen. So aren't we putting an awful lot of faith then in the airstrikes? And then we have to put that faith again back in the Iraqi military, who currently has not shown that they have the wherewithal to be able to protect and defend a lot of their own country. That in itself is frighteningly dangerous.
Yeah, I think one of the most significant challenges, as you mentioned, is going to be kind of identifying these targets and the critical, absolutely critical need for intelligence. Airstrikes are going to be precision guided in order to reduce or mitigate any kind of civilian casualties on the ground. But depending on where these strikes take place and where ISIS is holed up, this is made much more difficult in any kind of an urban setting.
Colin, about 30 seconds here. How long do you think something like this would take? Let's just say that plans are underway right now. And again, I know I'm asking you to speculate, but if you had to speculate on how long it might take to get airstrikes rolling and perhaps even think about launching them, what would be your best guess?
That could be done relatively soon. I mean, there's aircraft already in theater. There's the USS George H.W. Bush. There's the potential to secure quick agreements on land bases in the region with partner nations or host nations. So I think it could be done fairly quickly. I think the delay is really figuring out where these airstrikes would fit into a broader strategy. It's not necessarily the logistics themselves.
Indeed. Colin Clarke from the RAND Corporation. It's a pleasure to talk to you again, Colin. We will absolutely do it again, my friend. Have a good weekend.
Thanks a lot, Ed.
Here we go. We're just getting into it again now. And now it comes to the American people, because really, you've got a say in all this right now. Tell us what you think right now on social media, Twitter, email, and Facebook. And we'll talk about it here on Newsmax TV and on MidPoint, where we question everything.